get started right away. So quickly, I'll just introduce myself. My name is Sean Tracy. I'm a Senior Field Applications Engineer for Crytek. Basically what that means is I work with the licensees, trying to basically make the engine work with a lot of other different types of genres, rather than just a first-person shooter. So we do lots of different games like third-person games, MMO, adventure games, quite a few different things that the engine wasn't necessarily designed around, but can do pretty easily just with a couple minor modifications. So that's kind of the biggest portion of my job. I also come from the modding area. I was in charge of the MechWarrior Living Legends project for Crysis 1. So actually I got into the industry just through modding, and I love this stuff as much as you guys do, and that's usually why they put me up in front to demo it, because I get pretty excited about really small features and these kind of Crytek features, things like dynamic pupil adaptation when there's a little more light in the area than when it's dark, and these crazy features that we love putting the amount of detail into. So without further ado, I want to show you some of the major features that are coming along with Crysis 3. And this will come in our SDK 3.5 update as well, which is slated to come out a little bit this year. So this is the level that we showed during E3 and during Gamescom. So it's called Dam, or Canyon, as the level tells you. And some of the things that you see immediately off the start is the new particle systems, taking particle shading and particle lighting. It's all over the place here. And one of the most important bits of the engine is the what you see is what you play functionality. And all that means is that at any point, you can hit Control-G, and you're in the game immediately playing. So some of the cool things you can see, if you notice on the scope there, you can see that the chopper actually went through. This isn't just a cube map on the scope. If you see, well, I'm not going to zoom in on it. But you can see that it's actually just refracting what I'm actually looking at. So this is a nice win. You actually get what you're looking at, which is pretty cool. Something else that's new in Crysis 3 is the way we're handling cloth. It's not so different from an asset setup side that it was from Crysis 2, but on a performance level, it's much, much faster, and we can do a lot more of it in the scene. So a really good example of using this sort of cloth to a cool effect is when I go a little bit further here. There's a little part where this chopper is going to swing by, and we've actually attached wind to this chopper so that when he flies by, we got all these sort of cloth bits happening and all these things falling down. So right now this is all black actually because we're using some layer switching. I'm just going to hide that. So one of the other things that you're noticing here, right here, is particle shadows. So you see that these particles are actually receiving the sunlight and the sun shadows. This is something that came out just a little bit later in Crysis 2, but we've done tons of work on it since. And you can see that it gets a really, really nice effect. So things that work really good for this are things like volume fog, things like smoke, things like that. So I'm just going to go a little bit further on the level. And of course, I'm not going to show you every single new piece of tech that we've developed for Crysis 3 because I want to save some nice stuff for you guys to see and figure out for yourselves. But one of these nice effects here, it's a new type of shader that we're calling pixel accurate displacement mapping. So let me actually just select this here. Just want to turn up the displacement amount on this particular piece. All right, so the displacement's really high. I'm just turning it down a little bit so you can see all the details actually from it. So this new sorry about that, turn off my camera. So this new technique is actually not using tessellation. That's one of the beautiful pieces of it. So when you take a look at this tree, you see that there's actually a lot of silhouette details on it. So you get this sort of extrusion here, all these little sort of high detail, high density detail portions. Usually we'd have to use tessellation to actually achieve. But now we've actually developed a new type of shader that we're calling Pixel Accurate Displacement Mapping, PADM, for this particular technique. What's kind of cool is if we see it in wireframe. Now if I switch to wireframe, obviously everything's pretty dirty right away. I'm just going to turn off everything and only turn on the vegetation. So you can see that tree's not tessellated. It's actually only about a 3,000 poly tree, well, maybe 2,500, 3,000 polys or so. But again, if I go out of wireframe, you can see that there's silhouettes on this tree that aren't being created by geometry. This is all created by pixel displacement. So it's all pretty cool. And again, it's really, really fast. When you're in a scene that's really vertex bound, so things that have a really high poly count, this is when this tech really comes into action. Because this actually uses a pixel shader rather than a vertex shader. It's just a little bit faster if you're vertex bound. If you're pixel bound, then using tessellation makes more sense. So we've only got this on a few of the assets within this particular level, so I kind of just concentrate more on the tree. Some other stuff that's really cool from it is, of course, the way it reacts to light. Let me just throw a light in there so you can see. So it gets really accurate shading on all the lights. This is a little bit strong right now, so maybe we'll turn that down, 0.1, 0.1. And you can see a lot of these things are similar to how you've always sort of worked with the engine. So you can see things like self-shadowing, fun stuff like this. You can really see the difference between like a 2D plane for the sprites. You can see this on the leaves, and then the real pixel accurate stuff on the trunk. So that's pretty cool. One other point is I'll be taking questions right at the end. And actually, I have a lot more fun just answering questions and maybe little challenges and stuff like this. So I won't make this demo last too long or anything like that. So the other thing I want to talk about a little bit is 3D composite lens flares. These are pretty exciting for us. So it actually comes with a brand new flare editor, and this is accessed through database view. So if I go to the flare library, you can see that we have a whole library of different flares for each of the levels. And this particular one is the sun flare for Canyon. So I could turn it right off, turn it back on. I could turn off little portions of it. So we have a main glow portion. We have a ghost streak, which is probably the cooler one. I like that. That looks. Then we have these sort of iris lines, or chroma rings, rather. Secondary and primaries, and then some orbs. So what's cool about these is that actually all the parameters are exposed immediately. And you can see all these different sort of lens effects have a lot of parameters. So this is just the parameters for the orbs, for example. There's quite a few. So I've got control over all the size of each of the orbs. We can also do things like enable dynamics. So what that means is that if a bird flies between me and the light, it's actually going to occlude that particular flare. You can actually assign different textures. We can put a silly texture on there or something different if we want. We can even turn up the number of orbs or turn it down. Of course, it's actually set to a pretty nice value right now, and how much noise there is. So again, I'm just going over properties, but it's really easy to use because you apply them directly onto lights. Before, whenever we had to do lens flares, it was all procedural. So. And you can see this gives you a really nice effect for any of the lights, too. This isn't the only one that has it. If I move on a little bit further in the level, maybe down here somewhere, right near the dam. I've got a couple layers showing here, but that's fine. Go up here. So you can see that we've applied it to these glow lights here. And actually, there's not another light entity casting light everywhere. It's probably only one or two here. But you see, when we put these sort of lens flares on the lights, it's pretty nice. And again, the whole idea with the lens flares is that we've kind of gone the stylistic route of putting a film camera on your head rather than like a photoreal camera. Just because we found that people are getting more immersed in sort of a filmic sort of look rather than a pure photoreal sort of Crysis 1 look. All right. So that's about the flares. The next thing I want to talk about a little bit, since I'm down here, is about water and the way we're doing reflections on the water now. So you can see we've got a lot of the cinematic layers showing. I'm just going to hide a few of those. Nope. So on the water, what you see from far away is actually a cube map or an environment probe, or it's just a texture really that's telling it how to reflect certain things. And that's fine for us when somebody's really high up above the water because you're not going to see those really fine details of things being real-time reflected. However, when you get up close and you're standing in the water, we know the incidence angle of the player. So keep an eye, and I'll do this once fast, and we'll do it slowly. All right, with all these particles, it makes it a little bit more tricky. I'm just going to turn off the particle effects real quick so you can see what I'm talking about. Oh, ripples are particles, I guess. So what happens when I turn my incidence angle, you might be able to notice right here and then watch it scroll down. The real-time reflection is actually blending into the cube map. This actually usually looks a little bit better. Let me go to a different section, sorry. I'll go right here, maybe you can see it much stronger. It's really dependent on the lighting. Oh, that was a nice one actually. Since we have some debug stuff in there, you can see that that's really reflected right now. And then as I turn the camera incidence angle down, it blends to the cube map. Then back up, it goes back to real-time reflections. And we know that our player is usually standing like this in a sort of horizontal look. So if we're having real-time reflections when the player is running through this water, most times that's really fine enough. It's just when you're seeing it from far away that we have the cube map. Some other exciting stuff, and I don't want to talk too much about it, is the dynamic caustics. That's something you've probably noticed in the levels. You might have seen it in some of the videos as well. The caustics are actually being generated by these waves, and you actually get real sort of shaped caustics. As you can see, that's actually doing the ripple caustic. If I go underwater, you can see the ripples sort of propagating out. And if I just walk through, it's going to be a different sort of look. So again, we have control of the color, what they project on, how far they project out of the water, and things like this. But you can see this gives you some really, really cool looking effects beside the water, especially when you get real-time reflections working with the color. It's just all this detailed depth is pretty fun. All right, so moving on, I want to talk a little bit more about the lights and how we're actually dealing with those. And I'm going to go back to that sort of dam portion again. And I'm just going to head over to one of these generator rooms. Just jump in here. And I like to show the area light down here. Oh. All right. So I'm highlighting geometry. I'm going to turn that off right now. It's actually a performance thing, saying that this has too high of a collision mesh count. So I'll turn off helpers in a minute. It's not really a big deal. All right, sorry, it's going to come on a couple times. All right, so right now this is actually set to an area light because that's how it's going to be in the final game. But typically, what you're probably used to seeing is this sort of light. So you see that it's got a point highlight on the ground, and it's in the shape of a point, or a circle, really. What we usually do to hide this sort of thing is that we'll do a texture projection on it to give it some sort of shape, because having a point highlight is actually pretty unrealistic. You don't get that from anywhere in the world, because light's always coming from an area rather than a point. So to achieve that, what we've done instead is allow you to take area light. And what area light actually does, and I have to switch to this, and I'm sorry for the red flashing. You see that this is actually in the shape of an area. If I put it right in front of this light, we'll get almost a perfect look for it. And I'm just going to turn off helpers because this is flashing red. So now that it's coming from a certain area, you see that we get a very different effect on the ground than a point highlight. So I'm going to move it around a little bit so you can see. You see that we get kind of this square highlight now, and that's actually going into the specular pass as well. And one other nice thing is that the light's not casting behind itself. That's one of the most annoying things that we've ever had to deal with when you're doing lighting, because you have to either set up something to clip it behind there, or you have to use some sort of texture projection to make sure it's working properly. But for the area light, it's always doing an FOV of 180 or less. So if I set it to 180, you're going to get, it's going to be all the way to the sides, or if I set it to like 20, then it's obviously very, very small. And too small. So let's bring that back up. Off. I think I raised a little bit too much here. There we go. All right, so then what we do as lighting artists, we actually just line up the shapes correctly, and then you'll get proper lighting. The other nice thing about it is that we do something new with the area lights that we used to do only with the sun shadows. If you notice the difference in that area lighting shadow, it's a lot softer, and it's actually more accurate. It's in physically a more correct location. And that's because we've gone to more of a physically based renderer. The idea behind that is, again, to just get a much more realistic feel for the lighting all the way across the level. So what's actually happening when this area light is on, we use the variable penumbra soft shadows is what it's called. It's just so that the penumbra, or the edge of the shadow, gets bigger the further the object is away from the light, or the further the shadow is from the light, rather. So we turn that on when there's area lights. And if it's a normal light, then we don't turn it on, which sort of just makes sense. One last thing, not to beat area lights to death too much, but because we can now put the specular multiplier in a shape, that means we can also put it into a texture. So you get very, very realistic looking projected textures. So, I mean, I'm just going to find a some random texture here, I guess. Lights, I don't know, this would be cool. Just find it. That's probably a good example. So now this texture is actually applied to light, and if I crank up the specular value, maybe a little too high there, you can actually see the texture in the specular. That's a really bad texture to use. Maybe I'll just try one last one, and if that doesn't work, then I'll just move on. Let's use one with some texture. I'm just guessing, so let's see. Yeah, most of these are pretty soft, so I'm just going to get sure. All right, and then we'll just turn up the diffuse multiplier so you can see the shape of that. Actually, it's all broken up. One here, and same thing will go when we turn up the specular. So you get the exact same highlights from the texture that you should be getting from the diffuse pass. So the idea there. What you could do is, in a huge warehouse where you have something like a bunch of lights above you, so let's say this was a rooftop, and you've got hundreds of these actually, what you could do is place one area light, you could fill the entire area with all those hundreds of lights in it, then what you could do is make a texture that has the diffuse and the specular, cast it down from 100 of these lights, and just use one area light for all the interior of this sort of warehouse. It's a very, very good way to do things. So, yeah. Is there any questions on the area lights while I'm here? Sort of. It's kind of a cool place to be messing with them. No, really? Cool. I'll just move on. If you have questions at the end, we'll obviously take care of those. Yeah, and you can see the reflections of that texture actually right there too. It's pretty cool. All right, so moving on from area lights. Let's talk a little bit about the volume fog shadows. And usually I don't show this because it actually takes me a minute to set up, but I think you guys understand. I don't think you're going to judge me too much. All right. So what volume fog shadows do? We've always had volume fog. The only problem is it never really casted shadows, or basically held shadows. So when we have things happening like this, I'm going to get the sun up here so that we have sort of some nice shadows coming down here. Let's take a look. Some different time of days. Maybe something there. And now I'm just adjusting the lighting position. Right. All right. So you can already start seeing them already. They look kind of like sun rays, but notice how we're not really looking at the sun right now. This is actually volume fog shadows. So I'm going to turn up the fog so you can see this actually happening. So now within time of day, the values are shadow darkening, and I just turn them, yeah, I'll turn them down so that the shadow's a little bit darker. I'm going to do this, darkening sun, darkening ambient, and shadow range, I'll just increase the maximum. All right, and all I'll do is just turn up our global density just a little bit so you guys can really see these shadows happening. All right. Now I'm going to move the light around again, or the sun rather. So you should be able to see that effect pretty nicely. Now this is happening in all the fog volumes as well. So take into consideration what's happening here. This whole shadow coming from that entire building is now being projected down through the fog. So when you're outside of it, you can see the ray of that particular shadow. So you can see one here. These are sun rays, but this is actual volume fog shadows. Give you an idea, we'll move it around this direction. So those are sun rays there, and then once it goes away, it's volume fog. So again, just another really more realistic look. Again, it's more physically accurate because shadows do cast into fog, of course. All right, now I'm going to reset my time of day. I'll go back to something like 7:30. I think it's a nice time of day. Like that. And now I want to talk a little bit about the vegetation improvements. We've done that. So one of the things when you're working in Crysis or Crysis 2 even, one of the more frustrating things with the vegetation is that it didn't grow on brushes. So basically you could do terrain, then you could paint all your vegetation around as you liked, but you would never be able to tell them to actually paint onto brushes. So that was the first thing we did, because obviously you have to have a lot of rubble and things like this. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to erase all this veg that's here, and then we'll do it ourselves a little bit. I'm just going to jump in game because actually I like the lighting that happens when we're in this particular area. Just waiting for it to update. All right. So what we can do, I'm just going to grab one of these new types of bending vegetation. So what we managed to do, and in Crysis 1 it was not bad. Of course, we had a lot of different vegetation that would bend and react to the player. But it did take artists to make it. We had to put joints in them and things like this, so it did take a while. These ones are a lot faster, and we can have even more of them. So I'm just going to paint a few of these down. Let me change the density here. Maybe density of, let's say, 4. Density is actually just the distance between objects, so that makes sense. The cinnamon fern is probably, yeah, we'll just use these two. And one of the things that I was just talking about, the grow on brushes, we just tick that to true, and now whenever I paint, you see that it actually paints right up on the brush. So we've got nice veg, you know, growing out of rocks. Okay, it doesn't make sense, not so much for this one. But if you had something that was just like more of a moss sort of texture or something. So now I've got about 1,000 instances of these things, and you can see that they're already moving in the wind. But this isn't just some fakey sort of wind shader effect. This is actually real wind being simulated. And you'll see that when my player starts moving through it, I'm bending away all these pieces of veg. We were never able to do it on such a huge scale before, but we changed the way that the vegetation was actually doing the bending technique, and it's much, much faster. And it also works on consoles, which is a huge, huge win. Where this gets really cool is when you have characters going through it, dynamic objects, wind, and explosions. So actually, for fun, let's play with the wind entity a little bit. So I grab this wind, and I throw it down in the level. And the first thing I need to do is set a velocity. So, I need the wind area, sorry. Wrong one. Area. Oops. That's better. All right, so the wind area is just a bounding box with a certain amount of wind. I can give it a speed. So as soon as I give it a speed, that's those red arrows that you saw a little while ago. That's actually telling me all the directions that that wind is producing. It's really nice to be able to see it like this. We've always had the wind entity, or the wind area rather, but you could never visualize what was happening with it. So then the next thing I have to give it is, well, we've already got the speed and we've already got the size. Let's give it a little bit of direction. So I'll just say 1, 1, 1, 1, 1. Or actually, no, we'll leave it at 0 so that it's all circular. All right, and then all we have to do is turn up the speed. Set it to like 50. And we'll start dragging these around here. All right, it's not that strong right now. Let's turn it up. It's just really weak right now. The multipliers are a lot lower than when I did it before. My apologies. So, instead, let's try this. Well, I'm not going to beat that one to death too much. I'll just show you in a very different way. There we go. Much better. All right. So when that grenade goes off, you'll see all the vegetation actually react around it. Oh. Without a particle effect, it's really hard to see it happen. Regardless, we can play with it around with this a little bit as we go through questions and such. The last thing I want to show you again is those real-time reflections when you're out in the water and you've got this amount of vegetation on the edge. Should you have some nice particle effects going off with that grenade, which is not really happening right now. Oh. Yeah, it was because I turned on particle effects earlier. Yes. There we go. Much better. So anyways, there it is. You could also see that the wind entity was affecting that smoke there too. So again, I don't want to beat this to death for too long. But those are pretty much the major cross-section of the kind of the big features. Again, you're going to see a lot as you go through the game that has just been improved over a lot of the older engine versions. So that's pretty much it as far as this particular level goes. So if you guys have any questions or you want to see more of a certain feature or something like that, just let me know, and yeah, we can take a look at it. So thanks a lot, though, guys.